So starting with verse 1. Then 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, who had been dead, whom he had raised from the dead. There they made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of those who sat at the table with him. Then Mary took a pound of very costly oil of spikenard, anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the oil. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, said, "Why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money bag, and he used to take what was put in it. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. She has kept this for the day of my burial. For the poor you have with you always, but me you do not have always." Like I was saying, this tends to get treated like, oh, you've got Judas being greedy, and in contrast, you have Mary. If Judas's upbringing was the rich Pharisee background, he was probably looking to follow Jesus, because if you follow a teacher, what are you expected to become? A teacher. And they were not on the low end of the economic scale. They were on the higher end. Could very well have been Judas was thinking, hey, I'm going to get a lucrative job out of this. I'm going to have people taking me into their homes. I don't have to worry about a home then. They're going to be providing me meals. I won't have to worry about that. And they'll even give me money on top of it. And he's the treasurer holding the money bag. Enough money that they could be giving to the poor out of that fund. So, like I said, there could have been that kind of expectation, because his job, he was the accountant for the group. We get tied up in knowing Judas. How well do we recognize Mary in this situation? In the other account that is possibly not Mary, where it's known to be a woman of questionable background, if he had known, and that's the one where it says it's in the house of Simon. Where it says it's in the house of the Pharisee. Anyway, when we think about what it means with the things that Mary's doing, what we know of Mary, Martha, she's the doer. She's also shown herself to be the thinker, who has listened, paid attention. Let's be honest. Those people tend to be highly purposeful. They are dealing with what's right in front of them, and they're moving forward, always doing. Martha, why isn't she helping me? I've got to get this done, I got to get this done, I got to get this done. Very purpose-driven. Mary isn't the one who's worried about everything being right in the house. She's listening, and maybe, this is Richard Kellyism here, maybe she's the one that's more emotionally wired. Instead of thinking about all the grand, bigger points, she's thinking about relationship. She's thinking about what Martha has probably been saying all along to her and to Lazarus about Jesus being the Christ. But instead of being the analytical person, if you're the one in the relational situation and you've heard, and they're gonna kill me, how does the emotional person respond? when they hear, I'm going to die, and it's going to happen soon. I tend to think we see what we see here with Mary. One, she's crying. It's not just the alabaster, it's not just the spikenard, it's also her tears that she is washing his feet with and her hair. I think sometimes we sterilize the situation a bit instead of bringing the humanity into it, that not everybody is a thinker. Some people are going to be emotionally driven, and that's how they're going to respond in some situations. And in at least one respect, like I said, if any of us had a relative that was having hard medical issues, hello, we all know a couple of us here right now. That takes a lot out of you. And the worse it looks, the higher the stress level runs. And in this case, he's told him, it's coming. I'm going to be killed. And if you believe who he says he is, he's telling you the truth. This is gonna happen. And how well does the emotional person accept, I'm about to die? I think we see that in Mary. And I think we see potentially two sides. And I'm not, like I said, this is partially or a lot opinion. But the two ways I look at it. One, she could be recognizing her own sinful state relative to the Lord. Just because we're good people doesn't make us sinless. Without the blood of Christ, which at this time hadn't been shed, the only way she could look at herself would be as a sinful person. And to hear he was going to die, I'm assuming there's a lot more teaching that has gone on because of what we heard from Martha in the previous chapter. Then she knows why he's going to die. And for an emotional person, that would be shredding them. Because he's about to die for me. Mary's response isn't one of those, oh, here's your neat extra little story. Mary's response is almost saying, we have a balanced mix of people here. You've got those that are the thinkers. You've got those that are the workers out there fishing and so forth, hauling stuff in, doing muscle kind of work for their daily living before they're called. You've got tax collectors, accounting kind of people. You've got Mary, an emotionally wired person who recognizes one of two things. Either her sinful state that is putting him on that cross, or recognizing, like we covered 2 Sundays ago, when you encounter the Lord, it's a fall on your face kind of moment. Except she's been living with him. I don't mean living housewise. I mean, he was there. She's been experiencing, and now she knows the one who is the Messiah, the Son of God. Everything that Martha declares, she is taken fully in, and again, is recognizing the greatness of his sacrifice, even if she's not recognizing the greatness of her sin. And either one of those, especially in an emotional person, would put them in this place. I think this is important. One, as I've said a couple times before, we see embedded in Scripture human beings. That when you take the time to think about it, yeah, Mary's not Martha. She's wired the opposite way. Yeah, an emotional person's gonna respond to either of these two situations in this quasi-extreme kind of response mode. That makes it realer. But then there's the other part of what I've just said about her, that we have a hard time with today. Either recognizing the magnitude of our sin or recognizing the magnitude of the glory of God. Because today, when we talk about Jesus, how many people on a quasi-regular basis feel totally wiped out, humbled? I'll go ahead and put up my hand. Because for me, every time we partake of the Lord's Supper, I'm that close from being wiped out. Because I'm thinking through his sacrifice. I'm thinking through being his father and watching that take place. And it shreds me. I can take that part in. I can take in Mary being overcome with grief over her own sin, being the reason he had to die. Like I said, I'm that close every time we're at the table.
Well, you got to make it personal.
Yes. You've got to make it personal because he died for me personally. That's my sin that was being dealt with at Calvary. And in our culture today, it's only sin. Like it's only a little lie. It's only a little cheat. It's only a little. It's all that it took to separate us from the love of God. And the cost is that high. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, I was just going to say, a lot of people don't understand what it takes to even pull a nail out of your hand, let alone have one driven into your hand.
Exactly.
I've done this several times myself with a high-speed gun, and it hurts no end.
Yep.
And to just imagine someone driving something that looks like a railroad stake in your hand.
Right.
I mean, you're talking at least 3 blows just to break through the skin.
Right.
So,
exactly.
A lot of pain.
There's
And
an
go ahead.
interesting issue here relative to the figurative washing of feet. One, it was a hospitality issue.
Mm-hmm.
They traveled on dirty roads, dusty roads, and it was just when you brought them into your home,
Mm-hmm.
it was a welcoming ceremony. It had nothing to do with religion. But yet, you've got to humble yourself and respect the visitor enough to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So she was already humbled in a sense. And that, of course, leads to more emotion. It feeds your emotion.
Right.
So,
And let's tie into that as well. Because in both cases, the one with Mary and the one with the other woman, both of them, it wasn't their house. We know from Mark, this is in the house of Simon the leper. Mary went there with the intention of showing this honor and respect. The woman of questionable reputation went to the house of the Pharisee with the intention. And in the case of the house of the Pharisee, he had not already washed his feet or had a servant wash his feet. We don't know in this case. We know in that case, Jesus even points it out. You didn't even bother to have my feet washed, and she, from the moment she came in, hasn't stopped washing her feet with her kisses and her tears, etc. So in both of those situations, this isn't a spur of the moment. It's something they've taken the time to think about. And there's a reason why I'm always where I am when it comes to the communion table. Taking a lot of time to think about it. And it doesn't take much time as a father to think about where I would be if that was my child on the cross. To know that I'm the cause of that. But it doesn't even have to be thinking about the cross itself. To know that I'm the one that marred the pure vessel. When I was born, I was pure. After that, I made choices. I roughed it up, I scuffed it up, I messed it up. That's on me. Me and bad choices, selfish choices, whatever. Me. I'm the one that messed it up and has to turn in the nasty looking homework assignment.
There's a key point in this. I have a psychology background anyway, but I was reading some material on the mental illness today. It started with the homeless issue, and that almost all of them were mental cases because of either drugs or some other reason. But you think about humility, and the foundation of Christianity is humility. And you recognize and you can focus on the mistakes that you make. If you dwell on them, it'll take you down to a very bad spot. The beauty of Christ is that he says, don't do that. I'm here for you.
I want to follow on with that because you're going in the same direction I was going in. When it comes to the issue of humility, do I need to enumerate all of my sins to acknowledge I'm a sinner and to own that state? No. I don't have to beat myself up. That's just the straight up truth, period. Part of the problem, how many people own their sinful state versus I'm not so bad. I mean, yes, I've sinned, but in the grand scheme of things, my sin isn't nearly as bad as everybody that walks the street in Gainesville. It's just a given. You know what I'm saying? And you're all laughing because you do.
Well, that's the problem with people begin with. They compare themselves to each other instead of to Christ.
Yes, which then denies the humility aspect of it. Because the truth is, what am I doing? I'm throwing stones at somebody else instead of humbly accepting and owning my condition.
That's where pride comes in.
Yes. And then on the other side of that, when I have to go through and start identifying all that stuff and beat myself up, now I'm swinging in the exact opposite end of the pendulum, because now I am not focusing on the beauty of what is going to be accomplished. Because he is the Son of God. He said he will rise in 3 days. And as you point out, I don't care if he's going to rise in 3 days. It's going to take 3 hammer blows to get the stinking spike through the first part of him, let alone for 2 other parts of his body. That's going to be brutal. So yes, he's going to rise in 3 days. What he's got to go through and endure is off the charts for me. And yet, it accomplishes something so awesome. And we get it when it's on a smaller scale. We recognize that there were people who didn't have to die in the Twin Towers, but for the sake of others, stayed and did what they could. And the only reason we know about that is because some of them got out to tell. And we look at those people who were willing to give their life for another. And we got the scripture about that. That's awesome. Because they recognize how precious the gift of life is. So, when we hear this passage, rather than thinking even about the contrast Judas, he's got problems, and we know it. Mary, she has a potentially right perspective of humility, either relative to owning her own sinful state or humility in recognizing his Messiah state and all that he's about to go through. That's the part we need to connect to. We don't need to connect to Judas, obviously. There's too much of Judas in the world. We do need to connect to the humility that owns our problem, acknowledges the awesome that God is going to do to fix that problem so that we can rightly approach him. Mary does the awesome. And if I was teaching a little kid's class, that's what I'd want them to walk away with. Mary does the awesome. Being able to say, I made a mistake, is maturity. Acting rightly after that is the difference between a Mary and a Judas. Because Judas is going to acknowledge, I did wrong. And then he's going to do nothing right about it. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, there's another aspect that people aren't thinking about is the judgment people are getting when Mary died. We're judging her for one, for not helping Martha, to judge her for spending money that she shouldn't be spending, or judging her for all kinds of things that they don't need to be judging her for anyways.
Yep. Yeah, they'll point to the 300 denarii and say that was a year's wages. It's like, okay, it's a year's wages you just spent on the Son of God. Best year's wages ever spent. There's nothing wrong with honoring God that way. And Jesus says, you've got the poor with you always. In one respect. And what you going to do about it, Judas? Because who's he saying that to? Judas, the one who wasn't giving anything to the poor anyway. What is Mary doing? Giving it all to God. In the Mark account, it says this is being done in preparation for my burial. We don't have the opportunity to act that way towards the Son of God today. He doesn't walk among us. But we do have that kind of opportunity to show honor and respect to those who have gone on before, given a worthy example, and you can look and see the outcome of their faith. Because when we honor and respect the other half of the humility equation, we are showing those who are coming up what the example is that they're to be following. And the focus shouldn't be on the spikenard and how much it costs to have the event, etc. The focus is on the good that person accomplished. Because if you think about what Paul says about himself, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Paul's not saying, I am the best thing since sliced bread and Jesus was sliced bread. He's saying, I'm the guy you currently have access to. I'm the one who's striving this way. And the reason I'm striving this way is because that's how Jesus was doing it. And because you need an example, okay, look at the things, consider the things I'm doing, consider what I've said, what I've been through. How does it measure up against the Jesus you do know from the bit of scripture you've got right now? Today, what's going to impact a young person coming up more? reading the story or being emotionally invested in, say, Rusty. Because Rusty's a cool old man. He's got that whisker thing going on, and he's always got that neat smile, and he is definitely for FSU. But beyond that, and then we start naming off the things. Because they have an emotional tie to who Rusty is, when those good things start getting identified and identified and identified, what does the kid hear? He's my hero because. And it's no longer the facial hair that was the real turn on for him any longer. It's because of the things that they know are good and can say amen to. We need to be able to, one, even if we're not the emotional person, humbly put ourselves where Mary was, whether that be over owning our own sinful state or in recognizing the awesome that God has accomplished for us. And just like with Moses, it's supposed to bring us to our knees because God is that awesome. What he accomplishes through Calvary is that significant, whichever way you look at it. And again, this gets back down to what I've been saying. This needs to be our kind of communication that we reflect back at each other. Which is why every opportunity I can, if I can think of, because, okay, I'll be honest, I talk to Savan the most. So he's the one that I know what he's done. So he's the example I'm going to be given on a regular basis of, and Savan did blah, blah, blah. Why? Because if it's a positive example, it's a positive example, and that's what I want to be putting forward. So that when we hear what Savan has done, or hear what Jim has done, or hear what Vicky has done, etc., everybody. I'm looking for those opportunities. Because the more we hear about the good each other does, that encourages us in the same direction. We've also got the passage, and I'm going to get it wrong because I'm going to say Philippians is the passage where it talks about whatever is pure, whatever it is that's good, etc. Dwell on these things. Philippians, I want to say 4:3, and I'm probably wrong. Maybe it's 4:8. Anyway, the whole idea, what should we be concentrating on? The second one of those is the awesomeness of God, the grace of God, the mercy of God, the love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control, and I always toss one in there, and I leave out fajitas, and that's all okay. Because when we think about those attributes, how much better is it when we think about that attribute tied to a person and an action? Because now it's not just a word, it's a somebody. And when it becomes that somebody, that has greater stickiness to it. Because I named off all those words. If I'm not attaching it to a person, they're words. When I'm attaching it to a person and an action and a memory, or even, okay, and that's the other fun part to this, even when it's a story told that is relatable, in our brains is almost the exact same thing as experiencing it. They've done tests on this. A brief story that is emotionally relatable is almost as impactful as actually being there. Which is why when I want people to hear about Mary, I want them to think Mary was humble, either in owning it or recognizing the awesomeness of God. And because of either of those, Mary bowed down in submission to the Lord, showing his sovereignty in bringing herself down as low as she could. Go ahead.
If you think about all the people around Jesus that were the disciples and everything else, the apostles and everything, they all come from humble beings to start with. That's the reason why he picked them, because they were humble people. So, I mean, they weren't, outside Matthew, which was a tax collector, there was...
And possibly Judas.
There's
Yeah.
a few of them.
Right.
Which,
But with those few, how many people get brief stories of distinction? Woman at the well, the woman who washes his feet, the Roman centurion, and we're running out pretty fast. These are the people who showed distinction by recognizing Jesus for who he was, when his own disciples
people on the cross.
Huh?
People on the cross.
Yeah, exactly.
Everybody else was in disbelief, even his own brother.
Yep.
But people on the cross recognized him. for
Yeah.
who he was.
So the number that do the outstanding during his ministry, even though there's a lot following him around, still only a handful. We've named off 5. That's not a whole lot for 3 years' time. But then again, he was bringing a message that while they'd heard it, they hadn't heard it here. They could know the law without taking it into their hearts relative to God, and could be happy at being a good practitioner of Judaism and Jewish nationalism without ever knowing God. That's a Sadducee by definition. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, I was just, no, I forgot where I was going with it.
I'm sorry.
It's all right, that's me.
I cruise a bit too hard sometimes. And we see again the verse of this immediately with verse 9. Now a great many of the Jews knew that he was there, and they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. But the chief priests plotted to put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him many of the Jews went away and believed in Jesus. So again, we see this conflict, but at the same time, of course you're going to kill the other guy too, because you want to get rid of all the evidence. You don't leave him running around and saying, but he raised me. Just like that one guy. Well, you've got to be demon possessed because you acknowledge that he's somebody important just because he gave you back your eyesight that you never had. But we see that level of crazy today. Christians, we're all a bunch of closed-minded hypocrites that won't accept anybody else, blah, 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 blah. Now, who's saying that? The ones who are so tolerant and accepting of everybody except Christians. It's like, hello. Do you not hear the conflict? No, they don't hear the conflict.
Well, it's like political correctness. It's only good for one thing.
Yeah, beating somebody else up.
Well, it's only good for stifling Christianity and people that want to do good. I mean, to tell people the truth about themselves.
Yep.
They don't want you to teach them right from wrong.
Right.
And that's all political. It's only good for evil.
Correct.
Key element is we're so prideful we cannot acknowledge how imperfect we are to ourselves.
And that therefore gets in the way of the word. Because every time we allow pride to step up, we're pushing part of the word down.
You'll hear, like Bill Maher, there's several atheists that's written Bible and everything else. Like, man, this is great. This is the best thing that can ever happen. But because they're so prideful, they don't touch it.
Yep. Well, this was a fun one I read recently. I did not know science had come to the conclusion, pretty much statistically it has to be by design. I'm like, whoa. When did this one come out? It was in some scientific blurb that I was going along and da-da-da-da. And yes, science has come to the conclusion pretty much it has to be by design. You could not accomplish. And then they show you the statistics, the numbers as to the 0.0000000 amount of, oh, and then there's the one about 100 places out, the level of error that can occur with where the proton, neutron, and electron go swinging around. Because if you missed it by that big a percentage, all those 0.0000s.
Smaller percentage.
Yeah, I was being sarcastic, yes. That smaller percentage. If it's off by that much, nothing exists because it can't. It has to be that exactly right. And it's not just one big exact. It's like pretending that we blew this place up with a nuclear bomb and it all came back down in the form it's in now. We'd all be going, what kind of crazy is that? When you put that many point zeros with a 1 at the end of it and multiply it, you're going to get the same odds as nuking this place and having it all dust-wise settle exactly as it is now. Does that happen? Not without something causing it to happen that specifically. And see, that's the terrifying and awesome, jumping back to Mary, of recognizing God as God. Because, all right, right now, in my life, in too many ways, I mean, in classes and in life dealing with other people, birth and miscarriages. There are so many ways it can go wrong. There's a reason why we call it the miracle of life. And yet, knowing how many never implant, how many, I don't know what the right word is for it, when the body automatically gets rid of it before it goes to term. And that can happen within the first month. And in the case of the one we're talking about, within the first couple months, I think is what it was, where there was growth, but then it didn't attach. Anyway, it's a miscarriage. It's just that there are so many ways for it to not happen. And what's our population? Growing and growing and growing against the odds of it happening. And what are we doing? We're using all these methods to make sure it doesn't happen, and yet the population is growing and growing and growing. You look at stuff like that and you say, how in the world does a system where it fails so many times succeed? Unless it's not by design. So part of what we need to be taken away from the first part of chapter 12 is recognizing Mary is the one we need to be listening to in her response to being in the presence of the one who said, this is what's coming. And whether it be because of being humble and accepting her part in that, or whether it be humble and recognizing the awesomeness of what God was about to do through his son without even fully understanding it. Those are things we need to be taking into our character as well. Because when we can recognize and own our own sinfulness, it's easier to have an honest talk with somebody else who's struggling to recognize and own their own sinful state. Because if I'm pretty good, why are they going to want to admit they're pretty bad? If I'm a sinner who needed God's grace, God's mercy, and the blood of Christ on Calvary, I can communicate that better to somebody else as well. Any other thoughts?
Well, I keep thinking of the hymn,
Mhm.
Jesus, let us come to know you.
Mm-hmm.
If we could ever get that straight, that we need to go to red letter edition, and when we have trouble understanding who Jesus is, was and is, and we get to know him,
Mm-hmm.
then we're gonna feel more like we want to follow in his footsteps
Yeah,
and be like him.
I agree
Even if it's
100%.
painful ending to him.
Yeah. And I'll split the hair and I'll stop because we're up against our time. We need to do it the way you said it. We don't need to make it an emotional experience where it becomes a whole lot of frou-frou and don't you feel the love, etc., etc. But we do need to be able to recognize him being able to have compassion enough for the woman whose son had passed, feel compassion for her and what she was going through, knowing his own mother would go through the same not too long after that. Recognizing the humanity in that, recognizing that with all that humanity, he still chose to go through, as Jim has pointed out, all the pain and the suffering of the cross. In submission to the Father, Garden of Gethsemane moment, for us, each one individually. When we know and can communicate Jesus that way, making disciples is when we're going to have our biggest impact.